one of the things, again, not historically disputed, when D-Day is happening, and I'm saying this because at the time of the recording, D-Day was not that long ago. As we're having this conversation, when D-Day happened, the American people did not know what was going on. This is back in the era when loose lips sink ships, right? Like, we can't talk about what we're doing because if we talk about it, then the enemy's going to know, and that might lead to the loss of American lives. So FDR makes the announcement of D-Day while it is currently going on, and he has what was called a fireside chat. But what's crazy is, and by the way, you can look this up, FDR, as he makes the announcement in the form of a prayer. He says, last night I told you our boys were engaged in something, and now they're in something even more horrendous. I invite you to join with me in prayer. And you're like, what is he talking about? And he starts praying and says, God, right now, our boys are on this beach. They're landing, they're advancing. And in his prayer, he's telling the American people what's happening. And you can imagine the American people are like, oh my gosh. So they're probably actively joining in this prayer, like deeply involved in this prayer. This is just one of thousands of examples we could point out when people trip out over this idea, well, you can't have religion in government and politics. Let's go!
What is up, guys? Welcome back to the I Came With Fire podcast, where we try to be a bridge in the divide and have big conversations with smart and very important people. And on that, I am so excited to introduce tonight's guest to you guys. I've been a big fan of their organization and their mission and what they do. I think they're doing God's work over there, and really excited to bring it, introduce you guys to Tim Barton and the Wallbuilders. But before we do, I have to do all the obligatory stuff, like tell you that it only takes you 0.2 seconds to hit the follow or the subscribe button, and then go ahead and share this with a friend, and hopefully we can push this First Amendment content out to as many people as possible. It's not a big deal for you guys. I know like 70% of you out there are not subscribed. You just lurk and watch and you enjoy it. And that's nice, but it really helps us. And we have a big goal of getting to 10,000 followers by the end of this year. So please don't be a curmudgeon. Hit the follow button, especially if you like the First Amendment, America, the Constitution, things like that, because that is what we're going to be talking about tonight. So, Mr. Tim Barton, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and coming on tonight. By the way, guys, Brandon, I know he usually does all the stuff up front here for you. He is on his way into the studio right now. He got held up, something about a busload of Ukrainian orphans or something. I don't know, but I'm sure he's doing God's work. He is on the way, and he'll jump in here as soon as he gets here. But no, Tim Barton, Wallbuilders, sir, thank you so much. So excited that you accepted the offer to come on, and I'm really excited to introduce you and your organization to the I Came With Fire podcast family. Could you please just, who are you? What do you do, man, from the horse's mouth?
Well, thanks for having me. And disclaimer, like, it's my fault, the reason we had to start when we did and not have our other cohort with us, just my time frame and schedule. But I'm the president of an organization called Wallbuilders. The name has taken on a brand new meaning since President Trump first came into office. Where people are like, so Southern Wall, is that you guys? And we're like, no, I mean, I support borders, right? But like, no, it's not what we do.
Right.
The name was actually taken from a Bible story, way back Old Testament time. There's a guy named Nehemiah. And Nehemiah was the one when Israel was captured, conquered by the Babylonians, but then a lot of people were captured, taken off. And Nehemiah was one of those guys who was captured, taken off. He ended up being the cupbearer to the king. And he looked back and was just so grieved that Jerusalem had been destroyed and torn down, and his faith and his home. And so he actually is the one that led the effort to rebuild and restore his home, Jerusalem. And he invited anybody willing, come with me. Let's work on this together. Let's rebuild this thing. And Nehemiah 2:17 from the Bible, he said, come, let us rebuild the walls that we will no longer be a disgrace. And back in the 1980s, my dad was looking at the nation. And this was also at a time when in public schools, violent crime was at an all-time high, sexually transmitted diseases, teen pregnancy. Like, you can go down the list of all the things they were using to describe a moral decline happening in education in America. And he really felt kind of like a challenge from the Lord for him that we need some Nehemiahs to come and rebuild the foundation of America, restore the First Amendment, restore that religious and moral foundation, and get us back to First Amendment, Bill of Rights, Constitution, inalienable rights, that kind of stuff. And so for the last nearly 40 years, we've been working on reteaching, retelling the history of America and certainly highlighting a lot of things that have been left out or mistold along the way. We have what's considered the largest private collection of original documents from the founding fathers. We have tens of thousands original documents. So we have handwritten letters and documents from every single signer of the Declaration, every single signer of the Constitution, from every single president, and pretty much anybody you can name, noted politician, leader, American history. We probably have some of their handwritten stuff, some of their books, their journals, and we use those writings and instead of saying, hey, here's what some professor told us about George Washington, right? Or here's, I saw on social media this quote of Thomas Jefferson. We actually will say, well, here's his actual writing, right? Here's what he actually did. And so often, probably 90+% of the time, what they actually did, who they actually were, what they said, what they accomplished is totally different than the modern narrative. And so our goal, our heart, is to retell the story of America from original documents where we can tell people, please don't take our word for us, right? That like, this is the letter he wrote. This is where you can find it online. Because we live in an era of misinformation on crazy levels that most people have no idea how much misinformation they've fallen into and are susceptible to because they've never heard the other side of the story.
Right.
And we try to use the original documents and tell the other side of the story.
I love everything about everything that you just said. Like it just, oh man, it gets my patriot blood going. And I do got to say, I'm just going to shamelessly fangirl out for just a little bit. I have read The Jefferson Lies. I think it is a fantastic book. I always considered myself somewhat of a history buff, and I was learning things as I was going through that. We actually have the American story because we homeschool our children. So that's part of what we use for their history curriculum, right? To take my children through it. And I really appreciate just how effective that you guys have been about dispelling myths about the founding fathers. I mean, just to use the Jefferson Lies like as a particular example, like all the things that the mainstream media would have you believe, and the way that they've besmirched his reputation specifically is really egregious, and like there should be a case to be made for like defamation lawsuits. Yes. Right? But if only somebody were alive to be able to actually show standing in that, right? But because of what they've been able to get away with against him personally. And I also, I think it was you guys, where I first heard, it was just like offhanded in one of your podcasts that, I think it was your dad, David, that was saying too, just really quick blurb. He hit it and then he bounced off of it. And it was one of those like record, if I could talk tonight, record scratch stop moments where I was like, what did he do? Hold on. He just threw like a nugget in there and I got to go run this down. And that was just like, oh, you're never going to find the phrase separation of church and state in any legal document inside of the United States government. And I was like, wait, what? Because even I was one of those kids that grew up with this idea. It's like, no, it's enshrined in American law, separation of church and state. And I was like, wait, what in the world? So right? It's like we got to start doing fact check time. And of course, I don't think anybody that's out there, and hopefully we can get your dad on too, because I would love to be able to talk to him about some of this stuff as well. And I can tell you guys out there, if anybody has not seen video clips or know who David Barton is, this is not a man that I would try to fact check in real time. Like you will probably lose. Like I'll just say it that way. He knows his stuff. But yeah, run down that algorithm and then come to find out, like, yeah, nope, written in a letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Convention, and has nothing to was not a legal prescription whatsoever, and was actually more about protecting the church from the state than it was the state from the church. And it's just like, man, and then all of a sudden you have to start, paradigm opens a little bit. Now, okay, what else was I lied to about? Yeah. And that's what's so effective about what you guys do, I think. Go ahead, please.
I appreciate it. I was going to say, one of the things about that is you mentioned that you had kind of considered yourself someone pretty well read in history. And I would agree, like probably you are. The problem isn't that we don't have people who aren't reading, or like, it's not that we don't have people that care. The problem is that most of our learning is coming from modern storytellers and not from the original documents. And so when you have your high school teacher, when you have your college professors, when you have social media, when you have political pundits saying, well, guys, we know separation of church and state, it's the First Amendment. You're like, well, it's got to be the First Amendment because that's what everybody told me.
Right.
But again, like, if we would just read the First Amendment, or if we would go back and be like, well, why isn't this phrase in the Constitution? But most people, I think this is a fault, and I don't know that it's not a bad fault in the sense of it's not poorly motivated, but more times than not, we're fairly trusting of people. Now, I know people that have a military background might have a different feel, especially those that have done anything with intelligence. And at this point, by the way, looking at like the CIA, the FBI, seeing how much we've intentionally been misled on some of the current political things, you're like, I don't trust nobody anymore. I think Joe Rogan had a bit shortly after some of the FBI stuff was coming out. And specifically, actually, I think it was a COVID joke, I think is what it was. And you probably could correct me on this. You might know it way better than I'm telling it. But he said, when COVID first happened, I believed in vaccines and every one of them, and they're great. He says, now I'm not even sure we landed on the moon.
Yeah.
Right, the joke. But yes, it's because we're recognizing we've been lied to so much. And I think, again, not from a bad-hearted place. We just thought, well, we ought to be able to trust people, and we should be able to trust people, except there's a lot of people that are motivated far more by their tribalism, and they want their side to win, and they want their side to have control and power and carry out their agenda. And so the facts and details become a little swayed, and there's a balance too. We would tell people, we recognize there's a difference between the intentional and the ignorant, right? Because a lot of people are going to repeat what they've heard, and they just don't know the truth. Well, they're ignorant. They're ignorant of the truth, and I'm not saying they're dumb. They can be very intelligent people, but if you have bad facts, you have bad information, and therefore you're arriving at wrong and incorrect conclusions, so you're just ignorant of the truth. But there are intentional people that are very directly on purpose misleading individuals, and whether it be for political motives, agenda, right, whatever it might be, from a Marxist communist ideology that they've bought into some of these ideas, sure, but this is the reality of like some of these ideas where you could be very well read and be like, well, I know separation of church and state. No, you've read it in a lot of places. It just wasn't in the Constitution where you read it. Right. But until somebody points out these things, where so much of what we do, it raises controversy for a lot of people because we're challenging the status quo. We're challenging the narrative that's been there for a long time. And there's a lot of people that have been very secure in that narrative. And so they don't want to have the narrative challenged. But over 90, let's say 98, 99% of what we say, it's not even historically disputed, right? It's not like historians are like, well, I'm not sure Jefferson wrote that letter. Like, nope, Jefferson really used this phrase in a letter on January 1st, 1802, to the Danbury Baptists, assuring them the federal government would never come and restrict their religious practices because there was an eternal wall of separation between church and state to keep the government from interfering with the religious practices of the church. Well, that's where the phrase comes from. It's not in the Bill of Rights. It's not in the Constitution. It's in no official governing document. It's not until the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1900s starts using this phrase, and it's not until the 1940s, I think 1948, Everson versus Board of Education is the first time they use the phrase, and they don't reference the letter, where they say, well, we know Jefferson gave us separation of church and state. The reason it matters is when you use that phrase and divorce it from the context, it's easy to misrepresent what that phrase was being used to say, and that's what's happened today. But again, like what we're talking about, it's not historically disputed. No historian is arguing that phrase came from Jefferson's letter. It's just, it's not historically communicated or taught. And so most people have arrived at a conclusion without information or with bad information. And so when we bring this up, they say, how dare you, right? You're opposing what the founding fathers believed, separation of church and state. And so they are at times very confrontational, thinking we're, upending this donkey cart kind of scenario. And we're like, no, we're just saying that's not what they wrote. It's not what they said. It's not in the Constitution. It's become legal precedent today, but it wasn't legal precedent based on the Constitution. It was based on an overactive Supreme Court that was promoting an agenda, and it wasn't constitutional.
Right. And I think that you guys are so highly effective at it and are like perfectly poised, like in a place, in a time, come at the hour, come at the man. Right. And you guys have spent 40 years, like you said, honing your craft and, becoming highly effective at communicating this stuff. And in a day and an age where, like the point that you made on the Joe Rogan thing, where there are a lot of people that are starting to go through this like deconstructionist mentality. We talk about on the podcast all the time, like how dangerous that can be if it's not done correctly. Because if you start deconstructing just to deconstruct, I was saying the other night that one of the saddest fallouts of all the institutional trust that's been lost, especially in places like, public health, for instance, where you should be able to trust, that a medical provider, that medical doctors are going to give you, strong, sound, proven science, right? But then, like everybody saw, how it all got overly politicized instead of, running down the actual algorithm and taking us where the data took us. And then now you're starting to see young children, especially in like the southern United States, come up with cases of the measles again, because people deconstruct so far where they go, well, if that one wasn't safe, then all vaccines must be bad now, right? And so they end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But that's where I think that you guys kind of sit in such a perfect niche, because as people are starting to go through this process, right, and like especially, okay, well, what do they lie to us about, in history? What did they lie to us about, and so on and so forth? Like, you guys stand there to fill the gap, because if you, like I said, when you start deconstructing, if you remove what has been there historically, right, the question always needs to be asked. It's like, well, what is going to take its place? Because something will rush in to fill the gap, will fill the negative void, right? And I think that's where you guys sit, which is pretty awesome, to just be like, well, hey, can I just tell you the truth? Because I have the documents. Like, we can go read it. You know what I mean? And that's the kind of the long-winded segue of really the meat and the potatoes that I wanted to discuss with you tonight. And I was hoping that you would be able to kind of walk us through just how, and I'm going to give you the rope, and then you can run with it as far as you like, but walk us through like just how important Christianity and the faith was to our founding fathers. Because I think that there's been this misnomer that the United States government needs to be a secular government, and there's no room, inside of the government for people to act based on their faith. It needs to, like we said, separation of church and state. It needs to be completely divorced. And, you can't bring God into the government. But I have learned, especially through, content like yours, and then reading that I've done on my own, that Christianity was not just important, was foundational to everything that the founding fathers did, almost to a man. And the only signer that I think that was not a Christian was himself a purported deist, at least, and recognized, and was the guy that when they were getting ready to pass the Constitution was like, hey, the one thing that we didn't do this time that we did the first time for the Declaration, we had prayer. And that was Benjamin Franklin. And the deist, the guy that didn't even, I believe there is a God, but I don't think we should have a relationship with him. Even he was the guy that was like, let us beseech Almighty God before we do this thing, because we did it last time, and we don't want to mess up, basically, to heavily paraphrase. But can you please talk to us a little bit about that tonight, and just give us the benefit of your great knowledge on the subject?
I would love to. And it's also worth noting, like Franklin is one of the guys that people point to as the example of, like, we know the founding fathers didn't believe in God. Like, look at Franklin, he was a deist. And as you pointed out, like, Franklin's the one who suggested the founding fathers should pray at the Constitutional Convention when it wasn't working. They've been arguing for 4 weeks, and it's falling apart. And he's like, guys, we got to be praying every day. A deist believes that there is a God, but it's kind of like the clockmaker theory of God, that God wound the world up and turned it loose, and now he's just sitting back, just kind of watching it happen. And a deist doesn't believe that God gets involved. So for Franklin to pray or suggest we should pray and ask God to be a part, that's not a deistic suggestion. Now, maybe the bigger point, Franklin's one of the few guys that I wouldn't argue was a devout person of faith, like wasn't a Christian. I would say I don't think Franklin was a Christian. I think the vast majority, if not nearly every other founding father was. Franklin wasn't. But even Franklin wasn't what he's accused of today. He believed there was a God. He just questioned the divinity of Jesus, much like maybe Jefferson did toward the end of his life. Now, not to digress, let me back up, because not just highlighting that there were some founding fathers that maybe questioned certain Christian doctrines, the bigger picture is the influence of Christianity. And this is where Historians have documented this very well, even outside of us. So I would point to a couple of things. First of all, recognizing that America is one of the most unique nations in the history of the world. We've enjoyed more stability, more prosperity. We have more creativity, so many incredible benefits. But longevity, this stability is something quite interesting. There was a research study done by the Chicago Law School with the University of Chicago, and they identified that the average length of a constitution in world history lasts between 17 and 19 years. And that's the average length in the history of the world. We're 238 years into our Constitution, right? Next year, we celebrate 250 years as a nation. The Constitution came 11 years after the Declaration. So we're 238 years in, and this is unprecedented for the nation. Now, why was the Constitution so different? What made it so unique? There was a group of professors, specifically that the lead professor was from the University of Houston. His name was Professor Lutz, Donald Lutz. He decided, this was back in the 1970s, 1980s. He wanted to do a research project and see, where did the founding fathers come up with their ideas? Because even back in the 1970s and 80s, they're recognizing we're like nearly 200 years into this Constitution, and no nation has really enjoyed this level of stability. What made it different? And so his idea was, if we can go through the founders' writings, if we can find the people that they're quoting or referencing. So let's look for every quotation mark. Let's see what they quote, and let's go find that source. If we can track down those sources, then we can kind of categorize, analyze that data. We can see where there's certain sources they were quoting more than others, and maybe we can see where these ideas came from. What were the greatest influences on them? The book they came out with in 1980 was called The Origins of American Constitutionalism. And maybe it was 1981, 1982, but somewhere around there. You can still get that book today. In the book, they go through and they identify where did all these ideas come from. And by the way, just kind of framework as well. They went through about 15,000 representative writings was their idea. They were going to go from 1760 to about 1810. So from right before the Revolution till a little after, you have the Bill of Rights. We've now gone through a couple presidents. We have kind of the formation of the Republic. So what was really the influence in that time frame? And what they identified was the number one quoted individual was Charles Montesquieu. 8.3% of the quotes came from Charles Montesquieu. William Blackstone was 7.9%. He was second place. He did Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, very influential for anybody in law in America. Third place was John Locke. John Locke did the two treatises of government. He was the most quoted during the American Revolution, but because they're looking at a 50-year period, he wasn't the most quoted overall. But during the Revolution, founding fathers quoted John Locke a lot because he talked a lot about natural rights and alienable rights, which was obviously a big deal in the Declaration. Well, those are the top three individuals. But the professor pointed out, and by the way, this was also done in collaboration with like LSU, so a really noted project. But they pointed out those were the top three cited individuals, but not the top cited source. The top cited source in the founders' writings, they said 34% of every quote that we found in their writings came from the Bible. And what they pointed out is they only included things that were in quotation marks. Had we included the obvious biblical references in their writings that weren't in quotation marks, the number would have been way higher than 34%. Now, the reason part of this matters is because this was a group of professors that were just having an intellectually honest research project. So they're not coming in this bias saying the founding fathers were Christians, the founding fathers weren't Christians. No, they're just saying, let's just see who influenced the founding fathers. And what they discovered is the greatest influence on the founding fathers, more than anything else, and it's not even close, was the Bible. Well, to go further on this idea, we could back up to a different professor. There was a professor, her name was Alice Baldwin. She was at Duke University. She was there in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. She actually is the one that started the women's program at Duke University. So she was kind of a big deal, especially in her day. In 1928, she wrote a book called The New England Clergy and the American Revolution. And what she identified is that during the American Revolution, one of the most significant things going on was the voice of the pastors, where pastors were the ones leading the way, leading the charge. But she actually documents in this book going through how pastors in different areas were actually the influence behind these militias, were the influences behind these movements. But one of the interesting things that she concludes is she points out, when you look at the Declaration, the final draft of the Declaration, there's 27 grievances. And she points out there's not a single issue that the founding fathers brought up in the Declaration that had not previously been preached by a pastor in his pulpit prior to 1763. And again, she has the receipts, right? Like she documents. It was this pastor, this topic, this pastor, this topic. And what she concludes is when the founding fathers came together, they did not present a single new or unique idea. Rather, they repeated all of the ideas they had been learning from their pastors for the decades leading up into this moment. Now, the reason I would give both of those examples are both of these examples are examples of things that were well received in academia, things that other professors looked at and they're like, wow, you did a great job unfolding this, telling that story, documenting this. These were not disputed books, okay? And the reason it matters is the loudest voice in the Declaration were pastors. Every single idea in the Declaration came from pastors. The most significant influence on the founding fathers when they wrote the Constitution was the Bible, and it wasn't even close. And this is where today people look back and they go, I thought the founding fathers didn't really believe in God. And like, how would they be influenced by their pastor, or why were they influenced by their Bible? And it really is a reflection of how little we know of the story. The very first time the founding fathers ever assembled was September 6, 1774. This was when they're in Philadelphia. They're coming together, right? The Committee of Correspondence has been going. Now they've called people together, right? Send us your leaders. We're going to try to figure out what we're going to do. When they first met, John Adams actually recounts this. He's one of many, but I'm going to use John Adams because this is an easy name to look up and find the story. He wrote this in a letter to Abigail. And I want to say, man, it was the week after, and it might have been September 11th, which that might be in my head for a different reason too, but I think it was around there. It was the following week. He writes Abigail, and he tells her about their opening session. And he says, when we first came together, it was Thomas Cushing in Massachusetts who made the very first motion. And the very first motion made at the very first Congress was they should open with prayer. And he says, now this was debated a little bit because we had some congregationals, we had some like Episcopalians and Anglicans, and they didn't get along. And they're like, wait a second, we don't want your people to pray, and we don't trust your people.
Right.
And most Americans don't also remember, or maybe never learned, that in early America, every single colony had been formed by and large by people that were escaping from Europe, looking for a better life in America. But a lot of the escaping that happened in Europe were people that were escaping religious persecution that had happened where when King Henry VIII came to power in England, one of the things he did, for those that remember the history of this, King Henry VIII was married and he really wanted a son, and his wife kept giving him daughters. And he's like, screw this one, I need a new wife. And he goes to the Pope because he's Catholic. And the Pope's like, we don't just do these arbitrary divorces because you want a different wife to give you a son. And he's like, well, you're going to do it because I'm the king. And they're like, no, we're not. He says, then we're not going to be Catholic anymore. And literally, he breaks England away from the Catholic Church. He starts a new religion. They were the Anglicans. And virtually, they had almost identical theology to the Catholics, except he said, there's a few things we're going to change. He said, and as leader of the Anglican Church, I grant myself a divorce, which he did. And then they did begin to change some foundational doctrines. But what was significant about it is he said, everybody in England, you are now Anglican. And they began to pass laws enforcing that you had to be Anglican. And this wasn't just King Henry VIII. This happened all over Europe. If you were in Germany, right after Martin Luther, when his influence is there, Germany becomes Lutheran. And the law was you have to be Lutheran in Germany. You had to be Anglican in England. You had to be Catholic in Italy. And if you weren't of that religious denomination, or if you felt different than some of the doctrines, not only could you be persecuted, you could be arrested, you could be imprisoned, you could be executed based on some of your doctrinal beliefs. And this is what led people like the Pilgrims, the Puritans, a lot of the early settlers to America were fleeing religious persecution. Now, the context, the reason it matters, is because when the founding fathers come together, 9 of the original 13 colonies at that point had state-established churches or religions where, like, they've left England or Europe, and they come to America, and they're like, hey, the king wouldn't let us practice our faith. Well, we're going to practice it now. And essentially, each colony started off in little communities, and basically they made an HOA. And they're like, here's the rules of our HOA, and if you don't agree with us, you have to go somewhere else. Well, this is how the colonies, by and large, were birthed. And 9 of the 13 had state-established religions, but 2 additional ones essentially had state-established religions because they had dominant denominational ties or bents. And so the vast majority of the colonies are in this place where they don't get along with other religious denominations. They have this fraction, these issues. So when the motion is made from the very first Congress to open in prayer, this is part of the reason for the debate. And they're like, well, we're not letting one of your guys pray. We don't trust you. And it was Sam Adams who actually broke this frustration and division, where he rose and said, look, I'm no bigot. And as long as we choose someone who is someone that loves God, that believes in the Bible, that supports what we're doing, we should bring that person in and let them lead us in prayer. They agreed to call the local pastor, the Reverend Jacob Duché. The Reverend Jacob Duché, when he showed up, the records of Congress indicate that when he led them in this opening prayer, it lasted for 2 hours. And
Pastor, that's a sermon.
In the midst of this opening prayer, they also read 4 chapters of the Bible. Now, the reason, again, I would point this out, this wasn't like a group of pastors coming together, right? It's not like there's a group of chaplains and they're coming together to hang out, and what are they going to do? Well, it would make sense. They're like, we should pray. Let's read the Bible together. Like, that doesn't confuse us. That wouldn't, like, blow our minds. These are the political leaders of the day, the ones with the most vocal opposition, the ones with the best leadership strategies to say we're not going to stand idly by and lose all of our inalienable rights to these tyrants appointed governors by the king himself, these troops that are coming in. We're going to do something. These are the political leaders of this kind of rebellion movement. And their first move is to say we should pray, and they call the local pastor, and it's a 2-hour prayer meeting, and they read 4 chapters of the Bible. Again, none of this is historically debated. None of it. But I would ask, how many people have heard about this opening prayer of Congress? Or, by the way, there's an incredibly famous painting. If people just do a basic search right now, right, first prayer in Congress, go to images, there's a super famous painting of this. And why was there a super famous painting? Because this was a very well-known story. These are the things that today we have forgotten, or maybe have never been told, and often quite intentionally we've never been told.
Right.
The reality of this, but the founding fathers, as they're going through this cause, the very famous flag, the Appeal to Heaven flag, right, where it was part of a naval flag. It's the pine tree, but there's an appeal to heaven on it. This was a very big deal of flag. There's a lot of people in like some conservative circles today that are very familiar with that flag. The reason also, by the way, that comes up is because this is what the founding fathers largely agreed, that what they were doing, they were appealing to God to be the judge, to rectify their solution or their situation, to give them a solution. And this is where they came from, the whole revolution. And I really could go point by point, but I don't want to slow down the story too much and like get way too much in the weeds. But let me jump forward a little bit, because once we finally finish the revolution, people can look this up online. It's called the Peace Treaty of Paris. The Peace Treaty of Paris is what we signed to end the American Revolution. The Peace Treaty of Paris was signed by John Jay, by Benjamin Franklin, and by John Adams. They were the American ambassadors. Now, if you look it up online, you're also going to see there's a 4th signature. It's David Hartley. He was a British leader. His has a little blue ribbon on it. But what is significant about this? The signatures are on the last page. The opening page, there's a title at the top. That this is the peace treaty that ended the American Revolution, that brought peace between us and Great Britain. It established America as a free and independent nation. The title, again, look this up. Don't take my word for this. Like Peace Treaty of Paris, 1783, look it up, go to images, look at the top of the peace treaty where the title is. It says, in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. Well, what is that? That's a theological term, the Trinity, referring to God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Now, that's literally the title of the peace treaty, in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. It's the weirdest title for a peace treaty you will ever see, but it is a reflection of part of their belief and ideology. The revolution was an appeal to God. The revolution is won by the Americans, and they literally acknowledge God at the top of the document, which also, for those that might be familiar with the Bible, there's a great Bible passage, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your steps. Well, when it says in all your ways acknowledge him, when you put God at the title of your peace treaty, that's kind of like in all your ways acknowledging him. That's exactly what they did. And if we go forward, when George Washington becomes a president, we already kind of mentioned when the Constitution is written, Benjamin Franklin's a guy who's like, we should pray and ask God for help. They agreed. They bring in chaplains. They have daily prayer going forward. And this became part of the tradition. That why in the House and the Senate, we still have chaplains. Every session of Congress opens with prayer. That started from the founding fathers. But when you get to George Washington being president, and this is where I'm going to put the bow on the end of like this Christian thought of the founding fathers. When you get to George Washington being president, George Washington, at the end of his 2 terms, he did the farewell address. It's considered the most significant political address ever given by any president. And in this political address, he gives so many great thoughts and advice. One of the things he says is, hey, avoid foreign entanglements, because back then there were people looking and going, hey, France and England are at war again. And without France, we wouldn't have won the revolution. But we're friends now with England. We were largely English individuals in America, and we'd separated, but now we're back together. We're friends again. So you had a contingent of Americans going, we're pro-England, and a contingent going, we're pro-France. And Washington says, guys, don't get mixed up with foreign entanglements. Focus on American interest, which is also interesting, giving like our current presidential leadership makeup. Like, hey, let's put
Very
America
wise
first.
man.
Right. George Washington started that idea. George Washington talked about avoiding debt, how bad it was. George Washington talked about make sure that you put principle over party, because if we start to love party more than principle, then we will lose everything they worked to build. So he gives so much good advice in the farewell address. So if you haven't read it, I encourage you go read it, or like you can even have Grok read it to you, right? Like have technology read it. If it's like a little hard to get through, fine. You can find it online where it'll read it to you, but go through it. The thing, though, that's worth noting is there's a section in the farewell address where he says, of all of the habits and dispositions which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are the indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. Meaning, of all the things we could do that would help America politically succeed, he says you can't do it without religion and morality. He said those are indispensable supports. And this is a big deal because in the entire farewell address, there's only one thing he said was indispensable. One, religion and morality. And if you study the founders' writings, which we have done a lot, they're very clear. When they talk about religion, this isn't like arbitrary, like choose, are you Hindu or Buddhist or right, Islamic or Christian? No. When they say religion, they're very clear. They're talking about the Christian religion. And when they say morality, they're very clear. It's the morals of the Bible. What George Washington is actually saying is without religion and morality, that this American experiment will never work. Now, the following year, when John Adams becomes president, he then writes a letter to the militia of Massachusetts. And that letter is only like 5 paragraphs long. The whole letter is really great and worth reading. But the most famous line from it, he says, our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And this is where I think a lot of Americans have a disconnect on this, right? Like, why does religion and morality matter? Because we live in a nation built on giving freedom to people. But if you give freedom to people who don't have a moral code and compass, what happens? Look at what's happened in LA, right? Just recently. The riots, the crazy, right? Like, look at what happens in Chicago every weekend, right? The gang violence, the murders, the shoot. Yes, when you give freedom to people who don't have a moral compass built on something like the Bible, the principles of Christianity, freedom doesn't work. And this is why the founding fathers understood you have to have this. And again, this is like tying the bow full circle on this idea that we need God and Christianity. That was the founding fathers' idea. So not only have professors identified the most quoted source by the founding fathers was the Bible. Not only has professors identified that the loudest voice in the American Revolution was pastors and every idea in the Declaration came from pastors, the founding fathers themselves said if we ever get away from this religious and moral foundation, the whole thing won't work. And part of also why that matters is because when people today say, yeah, but separation of church and state, we've even confused what that phrase meant. They understood, right? And full disclosure, the founding fathers believed in separation of church and state, just not the way we understand it. Separation of church and state meant separate institutions, but it never meant secular institutions, right? Where we don't have pastors being our political leaders at the same time they're pastors, and we don't have our political leaders telling the church what they can't know. These are separate, but nothing about it was secular. And to give actually a really easy point in case on this, when Jefferson wrote the famous letter to the Danbury Baptist Separation of Church and State. That was January 1st, 1802. That was a Friday. On January 3rd, 1802, Sunday, Thomas Jefferson was attending church in the U.S. Capitol building, a church, by the way, that he had approved when he was vice president. He was in charge of the Senate. Back when the Capitol building was first built in 1800, it was this huge building, and the government couldn't do any work on Sundays because the Constitution said that Sundays were accepted. So Sundays, you weren't allowed to do government work, but there was a chapel in the House and the Senate, and they said, there's this amazing building. It's huge. It's beautiful. It's the best building here in Washington, D.C., and it's not being used on Sunday. Could we use it to hold church services? And it was approved by Theodore Sedgwick, the Speaker of the House, and Thomas Jefferson, the President of the Senate, who was Vice President under John Adams at the time. It was only a couple months later when Jefferson becomes president, and all 8 years of Jefferson's presidency, he actually attends church in the Capitol building. Well, again, back up. He writes this letter on a Friday, January 1st. 2 days later, not only is he attending church in the Capitol building, he's listening to his friend, the Reverend John Leland, a minister from Virginia, or I think actually Massachusetts, but he's listening to him give a sermon. He invited him to come preach in the Capitol. If the separation of church and state had meant what today we're told it means, not only would Jefferson never have approved church to be held in the Capitol, he certainly wouldn't have attended all 8 years of his presidency or invited some of his friends who were pastors to come preach. By the way, not historically disputed. All of these events I'm telling you, these are not historically disputed, and every single one of them you can look up right now online, and you will find exactly what I'm telling you. The problem we are living in is not that we are rewriting history like from our side, where people are like, oh, you guys are making this up. No. We're literally pointing you to the original documents. The problem is that we have not taught the truth for so long that this seems so foreign to what people have become accustomed to, that it challenges the status quo so much that when even, by the way, like, not to make breaking news here, but President Trump has acknowledged that when they have foreign delegations come in, they don't really have a very good place to host them, right? Because, you have some rooms in the Capitol, some wings where you can have a couple hundred people. He says, we need a bigger room. And he says, we need to build a new building here. They have 18 acres. That's part of the White House, a part of the lawn. He said, we're going to build a new building. And he says, and we're going to put a chapel inside that building so we can also hold church services there. Now, you can imagine people are going to lose their ever-loving minds when this happens. But this is actually historical. This is returning to a history and tradition, part of who our nation used to be, by the way, knowing that I'm talking to military people right now among everybody else listening. But obviously, you're somebody with military background still part of the service right now. One of the things, again, not historically disputed, when D-Day is happening, and I'm saying this because at the time of the recording, D-Day was not that long ago, as we're having this conversation, when D-Day happened, the American people did not know what was going on. This is back in the era when loose lips sink ships, right? Like, we can't talk about what we're doing because if we talk about it, then the enemy's going to know, and that might lead to the loss of American lives. So FDR makes the announcement of D-Day while it is currently going on, and he has what was called a fireside chat. But what's crazy is, and by the way, you can look this up, FDR, as he makes the announcement in the form of a prayer. He says, last night I told you our boys were engaged in something, and now they're in something even more horrendous. I invite you to join with me in prayer. And you're like, what is he talking about? And he starts praying and says, God, right now our boys are on this beach. They're landing, they're advancing. And in his prayer, he's telling the American people what's happening. And you can imagine the American people are like, oh my gosh. So they're probably actively joining in this prayer, like deeply involved in this prayer. This is just one of thousands of examples we could point out when people trip out over this idea, well, you can't have religion in government and politics. Religion was always part of American government and politics. It wasn't until the last couple of decades that we have so ingrained in the minds of people through a very broken education system that no, religion bad, get rid of it. No. Literally, every single president up until 2008, every single president said America's a Christian nation. They did proclamations declaring America's a Christian nation, which, by the way, even President Obama, President Trump, President Biden did official proclamations for days of prayer, because after September 11th happened, one of the things Congress did is Congress passed a law that said we will have a day of prayer every year. The president, by law, is required to issue a prayer proclamation. People can look this up. Obama did 8 of them. Trump did 4 his first term. Biden did 4. Now, if you go back and read them, it's very clear some people cared more about this faith idea than others. Like one of President Biden's, he said, prayer is important to a lot of people. And if you're a person that prayer is important to, we encourage you to pray on this day. But other people find solace in other areas. And if you're one of those people, we encourage you do whatever you need to do to find solace. And if you pray, this is a great day for it. Like there's not even a mention of God. It's so bizarre. But the point is, this was actually a law passed by Congress in 2001 after September 11th happened, and it's carried on all the way to this point. Not historically disputed. People aren't being told the true history of our nation, even up to present time, which is the only reason that oftentimes people get triggered by this. It's because you haven't been told the truth, not because it's not well documented, but because there's people who have had oftentimes a very different agenda trying to remove this moral foundation. Or, by the way, for the last 60 years, the founding fathers have been villainized and demonized. Back in 1960 and 70, people said, well, the founding fathers were like really sexually immoral guys, fathering lots of illegitimate children, lots of affairs. In the 1980s and 90s, we were told, well, the founding fathers, they weren't religious. They were atheists, agnostics, deists, separated from church and state. From the 2000s to present, we're told, well, the founding fathers were these racist, bigoted slaveholders. For 60 years, the founding fathers have been demonized and villainized. Why? Because there are people that want to remove the Constitution. There literally is a Marxist communist idea and remnant that say, we want to get rid of the Constitution, but you can't get rid of the Constitution just arbitrarily. What do you have to do? Well, first, you have to demonize the guys who gave us the document.
Right.
Because if you can show, well, look how bad the founding fathers were, then the Constitution is like the fruit of the poisonous tree.
Right.
And so you're like, oh, well, if they're bad, then we have to get rid of this too. There's been a concerted effort to demonize the founding fathers for 60 years. And this is not to say that the founding fathers were perfect and didn't make mistakes. No, the founding fathers were people. And fundamentally, I believe every person is a fallen person. We would, in the faith circle, we'd call them sinners, right? Like we are all sinners. We need a savior, is why Jesus came. That's my faith perspective, right? But I believe nobody's perfect, which is why Jesus came, and God doesn't even expect us to be perfect. That's why he sent Jesus, knowing we would never be perfect. Right. And I'm saying that because when I look back at the founding fathers, I don't look back and go, well, George Washington never messed up. No, George Washington wasn't perfect. But what happens today is people go, oh, George Washington was this incredibly awful, evil, terrible man. You find me a political leader anywhere in the world in the mid to late 1700s who is more honorable than George Washington, and I will wait. You take all the time you want to, and again, this is the problem. We are judging people outside of the context of the time in which they lived. We're saying lies about them. We're demonizing them, but most people don't know the reason this is coming to fruition, the reason this is happening. It's actually part of a Marxist communist strategy to villainize, tear down the people that used to be heroes that we used to honor. Why? So that ultimately we can remove the constitutional republic and we can introduce a Marxist communist idea. And I know we've now gone like way crazy circle rabbit hole from Christianity, but I do want to point out, like Christianity, separation church state, why are they demonized? In my mind, there's a lot of overlap with this. And again, the reason I point this out is because everything I'm saying, I don't even think it's historically disputed. Now, maybe there might be some woke professors today who were like, I disagree with you. Not historically, you don't, right? Like if you go back and read the documents, this is what they actually say. Go back and see what they did. This is what they actually did. It's just that you have a different idea or you don't like them or you promote a different ideology. This is not historically disputed. It's just not historically taught anymore.
Yeah. And like you were saying, like there is a very concerted reason about why and just how quickly everything went off the rails. Like you pointed out the timeline of it, of prayer scriptures being removed from schools. Abraham Lincoln, right? Show me the classroom of today and that will be the government of tomorrow, paraphrased, of course. But I love it, man. And I also love that you took everything back. You're like, well, if you're going to understand the birth of America, you got to understand, who were these people? Why were they leaving Europe? Why were they coming over here? We try to make this point all the time, and I love how effortlessly you were just able to wax on all of that. I can tell you, obviously, incredibly polished, and you know your stuff very well. But we try to point it out here all the time that it's like if you're to understand the mindset of the founders, you have to understand that it was about trying to enshrine liberty and. Yeah. We make a point here to try to push back on some of these like overly conflated terms, right? Because a lot of times, like, it seems the left gets to dictate the arena of ideas because they appointed themselves the arbiters of what you can and can't say, and then overly conflate the terms. And so you think you're arguing about one thing, but that's not what that word means anymore. When, you know, it's like, but not to run down that rabbit hole too far, but the idea that the founding fathers sought to enshrine liberty, not freedom, liberty to people so that they could do what they believed they ought to do, not give them the freedom so they could do anything they wanted. That would just be complete and total chaos, which is why I'm so glad that you brought out the John Adams quote about the Constitution. And it's an important thing for people to understand that distinction. Religion and morality is important. It is the bedrock of what we're doing here. Brandon and I had a fantastic conversation a few weeks ago about, you know, can the government actually legislate morality into people or not? And we explored that topic for quite a bit, right? But the idea here is the founders are absolutely saying, like, we're not utilizing the government to push this morality onto you. We all have an accepted view, and we understand where our ethics and morality comes from. We are saying that government should be instituted by men in order to protect, right, those God-given rights. And then you don't need my help at all to make your points because you're been doing this much longer than I have. But, you know, it's right there in the preamble of the Constitution and in the beginning of the Declaration, right off the top, that they are endowed by their creator, right? God's referenced again with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so, dude, thank you. I know that your time is precious.
Can I add one to that too?
Yeah, please jump.
So, and maybe this is a little bit of a pushback, but I mean, obviously, I would love to have this dialogue.
Yeah.
So, I would actually maybe couch it that the founding fathers didn't believe in pushing religion, but like you can't legislate religion, but actually, every piece of legislation is a reflection of somebody's morality. Right. And so, like, when people say, and I'm saying this because they're like, you can't legislate morality. Okay, well, is murder wrong? Of course it's wrong. Right. Like, how do we come up with that? Right. Well, our morals tell us. And this is where I would point out for the founding fathers, again, they did not believe the government should promote any kind of religion, but ultimately freedom works the best when you have a moral people. And it's a reason why even a guy like Franklin, who we can back up to Franklin again, I would not argue Franklin's a Christian at all. But Franklin actually advocated, and when he was the governor of Pennsylvania, as an example, he was not a Christian during this time. He actually advocated that everybody in Pennsylvania attend church. Now, why would somebody who's not Christian say, I think everybody should go to church? Well, he actually gave the answer, and it was very pragmatic. He said, because the more people we get in church, the less crime we will have on the streets. Well, yes, like that totally makes sense. But the reason, again, I pointed out is because they understood that there is a moral value that comes through religion, and the government doesn't tell you what religion you need to be part of, but they understood freedom only works if you have a moral compass. And one of the mental exercises I love to do with people, and this is often a really fun conversation starter to some extent, even with people that want to push back and they're like, well, I think you're totally wrong. And so my favorite question to ask is, okay, well, how do you determine right and wrong? Right? Like, what is the metric, the measurement you use to determine right and wrong, like your moral structure? Because there's only three options. And as far as I can tell, I've explored this a lot. I've only found three options. It's either subjective, right? That we determine right and wrong for ourselves. So it's up to every individual. Okay. But if it's subjective, then can you ever tell somebody else they're wrong? Right? Because if they determine it's right, you know, if somebody says, hey, I'm going to take a gun, I'm going to go into a school and start shooting kids. And I said, is that wrong? Well, of course it's wrong. But what if they decided it's right? Mm-hmm. Like, so subjective morality ultimately can't work for society. Well, then there can be collective morality where we can just vote on it. And I would point out, for the recorded history of humanity, right? Thousands and thousands and thousands of years of recorded history. Do you know what was collectively accepted by virtually every nation and every people in the history of the world up until like 100-something years ago? Slavery. Like, collectively, we thought that was right. Now, we would look and go, hey, was slavery wrong? Of course slavery's wrong. Okay, but collectively they decided it was right. Because I don't want to like overuse the example of like Germany, World War II, the Jews.
Yeah, it gets kind of tiresome, but still poignant. But
it's correct. Like it's still a good example, but the point is like there's so many rampant examples where collectively people have made decisions that we would look at and go, well, that wasn't morally right. Well, why do we think it wasn't morally right? Well, it's either subjective, collective, or there's something objective. Yep. An objective standard that is beyond us that we point to and say, oh, well, that's the way we should do it. And also, in fairness, there is more than one objective standard because the Jews have the Torah, the Christians have the Bible, the Muslims have the Quran, and these are things that have been around largely for a long time. So these are objective standards. And so then if we say, okay, well, we need an objective standard, what standard should we use? Or like, what's the best standard out there? What I would point out is if you're going to look at these, say, okay, an easy measurement is let's compare the heroes of these objective standards. So who is the hero maybe of the Jews? Well, maybe Abraham or Moses or David? Sure. Okay, who's the hero of the Christians? Jesus. Who's the hero of the Muslims? Muhammad.
Say his name. There you go. Muhammad.
Right?
Yeah. Of course.
Like genuinely, if you do a comparison, okay, so Jesus said, treat other people the way you want to be treated. Love your neighbors yourself. Well, David was a murderer, an adulterer, and he was a man after God's own heart. And by the way, I'm not knocking. Like Moses, incredible what God did through him. Yeah, Moses also was a murderer, right? Abraham was a coward and liar because when he was traveling with his wife and he went before a foreign king and the king was like, that girl's pretty. He's like, oh, this is my sister. Do you want her? Like the dude offers his wife to save him. What kind of coward loser are you, right? Like instead of being like, I put myself between my wife, my family, and danger. Nope, he offered his family to save himself. Well, you're a coward and a liar in the midst of it. But the reason I bring this up is because when you compare the heroes, there's not even a comparison between who they were and what they did. And why does it matter? Because it's very clear there's one objective moral standard that is higher. And as a society, you have to have some kind of moral code and compass you follow. And part of what leads to our legislation, why do we think, by the way, that it's wrong to drive 50 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour in a school zone? Because kids, we want to take extra care to protect them. Why? Because there's a higher value placed on kids. Why? Well, it's actually a biblical thought. Jesus said, suffer the little children to come to me. Don't hinder them. God placed a value on kids. There's a lot of cultures that didn't. This was a Christian idea. And again, the reason I bring this up is every piece of legislation reflects somebody's morality. So it's not a question of do we legislate morality? It's a question of whose morality are we going to legislate? In California, when they said, hey, if you want to steal something, as long as it's less than $1,000, totally fine. Well, that's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. Right. That's a reflection of somebody's morality. Every single standard, every single law is a reflection of somebody's morality. So it's not a question of do we legislate morality? It's a question of whose morality are we going to legislate?
Right.
But this is where the difference is. This is not saying like you have to be a Christian and go to church and read your Bible. No. But there has to be a standard saying, hey, it's wrong to steal. It's wrong to murder. Right? Like these are basic standards, and people might say, well, we've evolved to that place. Okay, really? Like you have to be incredibly naive, or you've never traveled the world if you think that all humans have evolved to the place that we just naturally know right and wrong now. Like genuinely, you have not paid attention to the world. And I think part of the challenge is people have grown up in an American culture that has been so influenced by Christianity that what we take to be normal, right?
The fish doesn't know it's wet.
Normal in the world to where, right? I mean, even somebody that grew up, like right now, if there's people listening and they're like, man, I'm not sure about this God thing, right? Like you're talking a lot about Christianity, like that's not really me. Cool. Let's say you're an atheist, you don't believe in God, you hate God, whatever it is. Cool. I would be willing to bet that there was a grandparent, there was a coach, there was somebody in your life who said, hey, you need to treat other people the way you want to be treated, right? Well, guess where they learned that standard? Jesus. America has been so permeated by Christianity that even if you grew up secular in America, you've still been influenced by the principles of Christianity. This was the moral code that shaped the nation, that shaped the laws of the nation, that helped us be the most free, stable, prosperous people in the history of the world. And so part of where the challenge is today is we're divorcing that moral standard further and further and further away from our daily life. And this is why we're seeing more and more chaos. again, it's not a question of that the government should tell us all we have to go to church or read the Bible or love Jesus. No. But there has to be a moral standard we follow. And where do we learn that moral standard? There has to be something that we point to. It's either subjective, collective, or objective. Yep. And the only one that works is objective, and it's objective. Well, then which one are you going to choose? And Jesus, by far, is the greatest moral teacher that's ever lived in the history of the world. And so I don't know that you would disagree with anything I've said, but just like the semantics of how I would couch it, the founding fathers didn't want to force religion on anybody, but they definitely believed that the federal government should uphold a moral standard because that morals is what allowed us to be a free people.
Right. I actually, in the conversation that I was telling you about, I was actually on your side of what on that one, because I think too.
You would call that the right side.
Thank you. Right. Yeah. I mean, correct. Right. So no, but the way that I try to break it down, and you're incredibly effective, right, at like how you present these arguments. Is, well, the whole can you legislate morality problem. It's like, well, what does a law do? A law compels somebody's behaviors. You're saying I either want you to act in this way or not act in that way, right? So you are, well, why then do you want them to either act in a way or not act in a way? Oh, well, because doing that is wrong. You know, stealing something from somebody else is wrong. So I'm like, okay, so you are using a law to then legislate the morality of what you think is wrong onto people. Like, just kind of walk the dog for them on that. But then it's like, oh, well, I think the kind of circles us back to the beginning of the conversation about things getting just kind of ideas that are laundered into the public, into the education space, and then they just kind of are allowed to like propagate like a fungus. And so I think this is largely one of those too, where it's like, well, I heard my ethics professor say one time that you can't legislate morality, and it's like, oh yeah, that's right. Did he also teach you causation doesn't equal, or what's the old saying? Correlation doesn't equal causation, right? Okay, they taught you a lot of fancy things in that school. I wish to God they would have taught you the meanings to them, right? So, but I know that you had a hard out time today, Tim, and I already took you past it. You were cooking so well, man, that I didn't want to jump in and divert you off your path. But I really appreciate your time this evening. I'm really hoping to be able to talk you or somebody else from the Wallbuilders team to come back. I would like to be able to develop somewhat of a relationship between the channel and what you guys do over there, because I think it is such important work and you guys do it so effectively. So thank you so much for coming on and having this discussion with me and for the I Came With Fire folks. And if you would, man, on the way out, just take the time to tell everybody like where they can find you, how they can get involved with Wallbuilders and all that stuff. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, yeah, and I would love to come back at a time when there's not like a hard out, and maybe like just for fun, if there's some great comments where people have questions or like, I don't think that's right. I would love to explore that so that we can be super relevant and maybe help. If there's people watching right now and you're like, I think you're full of crap, and here's why, great. Like, let's dive into it and talk about it. So I'd love to come back. If people want to know more, they can go to wallbuilders.com. We're also all over social media. We have the Wallbuilders Show. It's a daily podcast. We're just all over the place, but wallbuilders.com, tons of resources. You also can find a lot of our resources available on amazon.com, but wallbuilders.com, easiest place to go.
Absolutely. And guys, please do, we're going to paste their information, the links in the show notes below this video. So definitely go check those guys out if you can. And if you're in and around the Texas area, definitely go see their library. Go check out their campus. It's definitely on my bucket list of items once I get decoupled from the military and have space and freedom to travel when and where I like. I definitely plan on coming to see you guys. It's something I want to put my eyes on as well. But Tim, thank you so very much for your time. Thanks for coming on and discussing with us. Guys, if you enjoyed this content, please take just a little bit of your time, hit that follow button or subscribe depending on what platform you're on. Help the channel out. If you know somebody that would like content like this, take a little extra time, go ahead and share this video with a friend. Help us make our goal of hitting 10,000 subscribers by the end of the year. We are well on our way thanks to you guys, but hey, we're not there yet. So guys, I hope that you've enjoyed this episode. Please go, one of the other best ways to support us is to support our sponsors. You'll find those guys over in the show notes as well, so check them out, and definitely go check out Wallbuilders. And Tim, I can't wait to do this again, man.
Sounds great.
Awesome. All right, guys, go with God, and don't be a dick.